Hello and welcome to Assignment 3. Kathy here again. We're going to build in Assignment 3 on what you learned about line and motion in Assignment 2, and we're going to expand that now and begin to talk about two-dimensional shape and space. And as a warm-up for that, I'd like you to look at this image for just a moment. Now, of course, this would be more fun if I could do this with you in person. When I ask my face-to-face classes to tell me what they see, there's silence for a moment while they think about whether this is a trick question, and then they kind of look at each other, and then finally 2 or 3 people get the courage to kind of blurt out, "It's an airplane!" and of course, it is an airplane. But then my next question is, what more do you see? And after a while, somebody usually says, "It's a white airplane on a black rectangle," because they can't find anything else in the image to see. And that's exactly the point. There are 2 shapes in this image, one that everyone sees, this white shape, and one that nobody sees to start with, the black rectangle. So tonight is the night when you, or today is the day, depending on when you're paying attention to this video. Now is the moment when you advance from being a layperson who sees only the white airplane to being a designer who sees the whole format. And that means this black rectangle. The black rectangle is a much bigger shape than the white airplane, and yet it's a little bit invisible. Let's go on and look at another image. This one might be a little bit more difficult to identify. Look at that and tell yourself what you think it is, what you're seeing. Usually when I show this to students, they're a little bit confused this time, and they eventually say that they think it might be mice on a bus, or mice on a speedboat, or mice driving a big car with more than one steering wheel. A little hard to tell what it is. Definitely some mice, or maybe some mooses. But of course, if you reverse the values in this so that it's white on black instead of black on white, and then if you turn it upside down and flip it, you might be starting to recognize what it is. It's really actually a zoomed in piece of this picture. You can see those upside down mice right there. And the point of that, of course, is that figure-ground relationships change dramatically depending on the relationship of the image to the format. In this image, the negative shape is much smaller, and the image is cropped so that the mice, which are upside down in this picture, are much more obvious. In this picture, of course, they have resumed their actual identities as landing gear for the airplane. Figure-ground relationships are what we're talking about when we talk about positive and negative space. And I'd like to define those terms before we start, at least roughly. They're easier to say than they are to define, but we'll say to start off that positive space is space that acts like that airplane acted. It's a subject. It asserts itself. It's a prominent focal point. A positive space is the space that any layperson walking innocently into a room and asked to look at a picture would look at and pay attention to and say, "Yep, that's an airplane." The negative space is the space around, and of course if there's more than one subject, it may be the spaces between the subjects or the positive space in an image. It's often called the background. The words positive and negative have obviously a positive and negative connotation, as if positive space is good and negative space is bad. Well, that's not how we're intending them here. We simply mean that positive space is the space most people pay attention to. Negative space is the background, or the space that people often don't pay as much attention to. Designers have to pay attention to it. The figure-ground relationship means the positive and negative shapes and the way they relate to each other, how strongly positive, how strongly negative they are, and their relative sizes and importance. Let's look at some compositions and see if we can begin to identify what makes a shape look positive and what makes a shape look negative, just a little bit more specifically. Take a look at this fascinating composition here. Let's say that the composition ends here at the edges of this rectangle. So I've outlined for you a format. That's the composition. This is the screen. And this is always a problem when discussing these things because our eyes recursively look out further and further and further. It can get a little difficult to say where a negative shape ends in particular. But anyway, we'll say that the format ends here. And within that format, of course, there are two shapes, which I think you'll now be able to easily identify. The black one, which is a circle, and the white one, which is a square with a circle cut out of it, right? Which shape looks positive to you? Now, this is a question that has no right answer. It's a subjective question. And if you feel that this white shape looks positive to you and the black shape looks like a hole in it, you are absolutely within your rights. Most people, and I've asked a lot, most people feel that the black circle is the positive shape. In other words, if they walked into the room with a completely innocent mind and somebody asked them what that's a picture of, they would say, that's a black circle. And they would ignore the white ground. They would tend to ignore the white ground. Some people, though, insist that they see that white block with a hole in it, and you may be one of them. Let's look at another example here. Now, which is the positive shape? Yeah, this is the positive shape, right? Very, very difficult to see this white block as a piece of Swiss cheese with one hole now because the shape has a face on it, or at least it looks like a bowling ball, right? It's got three little ellipses on it that identify it as the positive shape. We're kind of hardwired to see faces, as I've pointed out before, with the most simple of means. Any artist can make us see a face. So it's very, very difficult to see this now as a positive shape. I find when I ask my students about this composition, which is identical to the first one except the values are reversed, that a lot more people insist that they can see the black square as a positive shape. It's a black square with a hole in it. Still, most people say that it's a white circle on a black ground, just the way that we said that it was a white airplane on a black ground. But maybe the fact that the square is black gives it a little bit more presence. Maybe the fact that it was white before makes it look like a blank canvas, an empty sheet of paper, something that we would normally associate with the idea of a background. Let's look a little further. What if I do this to my composition? What if I multiply that black circle and put them so close to each other that they cut off little white shapes in between them? Look at that for a moment and ask yourself, what are the positive shapes here? Now, there's no right answer, of course. Most of my students, most of the people that look at this, seem to agree that the black circles are still a little bit more dominant. But a lot of people now can look at this, sort of squint at it and look at it and see these white diamonds here, these sort of curvaceous diamonds. They can see those as shapes against a black ground if they really, really try. I'd like you to notice that the way this composition is designed, the black circles fit and exactly touch the edge on the left and the bottom, but on the right and the top, they seem to go out the edge of the box, right? We can tell because our brains are designed to work with closure that this really is intended to be a circle, right? And that it kind of continues out the edge. Let's look at a couple other cases of this composition, very similar to it. What if we contain all those circles within the boundary of the square? I don't know if you'll agree with me, but I feel that when I contain those circles within the boundary of the square, the circles become much more assertive. I think one reason is that these white diamonds now are revealed as simply being leftover, because here on the edge I only see a partial diamond, whereas the circles are very, very carefully contained within the box. It's as if the box had been made to exactly fit those circles, right? So the circles gain a little more importance, I think, from the fact that they are tucked exactly within the box. Let's look at it the other way. What if the circles go out of the box and the white shapes are contained within? My feeling is that of all three of these compositions with the white diamonds, this one is the one where I find the white diamonds easiest to focus on, easiest to make feel positive. The circles still are more assertive for me, but it's easier for me to make those white diamonds seem positive. That sentence is a sentence about figure-ground relationships, and that sentence reveals that, at least for me, positive and negative are not completely cut and dried quantities. Shape can have a feeling of being positive, but it can lose that feeling as I focus on the shape next to it. It can lose that feeling as it begins to flow out the edge of a format. What do we see here? The same circle, right? But much bigger in the format. Of course, this isn't really a circle. It's closure that convinces us that it's a circle. It's that principle of closure, that Gestalt principle. But it's pretty clear that that's a circle. However, a lot of people, when they see this, tell me that they can focus on this shape, which is actually two shapes, this smooth white curve here, that they can focus on that and see it as something like a skateboard ramp, something that has presence, has positivity. And if that's the skateboard ramp, this would be, say, the night sky above the skateboard ramp. So this would become a negative shape. I don't know if you'll agree, but think about it for a moment. And then I'm going to make one little change in this composition, give you a chance to decide which shape you now think is positive and which shape you now think is negative. What changes for you here? When I add these three little triangles, I find that a lot of people can suddenly see this white area as positive. I don't know why that is. These little triangles are added on to the white area and seem to give it teeth or noses or fingers or something. A lot of people say that this now becomes a snowy field with snow-covered pine trees in it, photographed with a fisheye lens, and that this is now the sky for them. Some people say that this is a Pac-Man with a complicated mouth here. However, adding this focal point, adding this layer of detail certainly seems to change the figure-ground relationships here somewhat. Let's look a little further. So far we've been working with a geometric shape, the circle mostly, and I've added some ellipses and some triangles and things like that here and there. My own strong feeling is that shapes that can be named have a very strong advantage in appearing positive. So the human face, the letter W, the circle, all those things have an advantage in appearing positive. Shapes that are small and contained have a better chance of appearing positive. Shapes that are large and go out the sides of the format have a much higher chance of appearing negative. And so I'd like to just look at that same format again. We have a small, actually a collection of black shapes here. And although they are not geometric and they are a little bit random looking, they're still fairly easy to name, right? Most people look at this and when I say, what is it? They say it's a splash or it's a drip. Somebody spilled their coffee. They can say what that is. It's a shape that looks quite familiar, even though it's a random shape. Whereas this shape, this white shape, this great big white shape that's so hard to see, this negative shape, how do you name that shape? Well, you have to name it in reference to the positive shape, right? You have to say, it's a big white rectangle with a spill or a splash mark cut out of it. Let's try one more thing with this composition. I'm going to zoom into it here. Same composition, we've just zoomed in. And now, what's positive here? The black shapes or the white shapes? There are more than one of each now. We have, by my count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 black shapes. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 white shapes. So fairly even numbers, fairly even acreage. They both flow out the edges of the page. None of them are contained in the format. And the edges here are fairly evenly split between being black and being white. This whole edge is pretty much white. This edge is almost all black, and the rest of the edges are fairly evenly split. I would suggest that it's hard to tell. My classes are usually pretty evenly split. They think that these shapes look like things you'd see under a microscope. They're kind of amoeba-like. They don't exactly know how to name them. They seem to have an equal amount of detail, an equal amount of interest, an equal amount of framing by the edges of the format. And so people are pretty mixed usually about which shapes are positive and which shapes are negative. You are allowed to have your own opinion about this, as about all the compositions I've showed you. But that's what I hear from folks. So what I'd like to do is develop a theory with you about what makes a shape appear positive and what makes a shape appear negative. We've seen that these concepts are a little bit fluid and that they're subjective. In other words, they will, some of these factors will be stronger for some viewers than they are for other viewers. But in general, I would like to suggest that positive shapes are smaller than negative shapes. It's hard to make a shape appear positive against a background if it's way, way larger than the background. Not impossible, but harder. Positive shapes are typically contained within the format. Now that's obviously not always true, right? So imagine that airplane. If it had been a little bit cropped, you'd still have recognized it as an airplane. But negative shapes tend to flow out the borders. And this is one of the strongest tendencies, I think, that makes a shape appear negative. Positive shapes or positive spaces are easier to name often. They often depict something, or if they don't depict something, they're often geometric or have a feeling of being vaguely recognizable in some way. Negative spaces are a little bit harder to name. They may be amoeba-like. They may have to be named with reference to the positive space. It's got a hole in it, the shape of the subject, and it goes out to the edges. Positive spaces are, I mean, this is almost by definition more interesting. Negative spaces do not grab your attention as much. Positive spaces look intentional or designed. Negative spaces often look like what's left over. Positive spaces are often more numerous, and the negative space is often one large shape. I get a lot of disagreement about this from my students, and yet I find when I walk around and look at their designs and ask them to count their white shapes and count their black shapes, they will often have many, many shapes of one value and only one or two of the other value, and that's the one that's looking negative. So if you don't agree with me on that one, Just remember it, keep it in mind, and try it yourself. I also believe that black or dark colors may have an advantage, but this is only when all other things are equal. I think that white, because of our customary paper color, and light blue, because we associate it with the sky, often tend to function as background and can be more difficult to make pop out and appear as a positive shape. But anyway, you tell me if you think that's true. I think that these are some of the most important factors that tend to make a shape look positive or tend to make it look negative. And you'll probably find other qualities that you can add to this list as you work on assignment 3. We've looked at very, very simple compositions so far. In real life, and even in painting, the positive negative relations or figure ground relationships are much, much more complex. And they're very, very fluid. So obviously, if the first thing that you look at in this Cézanne painting is this beautiful, ripe apple, then the spaces behind it are functionally negative spaces for you as you're looking. But as you move down through the apples and begin to look at the white plate, which was a negative shape when you were looking at the apple, the white plate becomes a positive shape against the table and the shadow. As you look at the table, as you begin to look at the brushwork and see the gradient and the color here, it becomes a positive shape against the wall. And so even in this fairly simply composed painting, the positive and negative relations are much more complex than the ones in the simple compositions we've been looking at. In a painting like this, they get even more complex and thrilling. I love Goya because of his mastery of composition and amazing use of figure ground relationships. But as we look at this painting of the boy with cats, most people tell me that the most positive shape in the painting for them is the boy. That's the focal point. This is where their eyes go. That bright red outfit that he's got on with the lacy detail is very, very eye-catching. And of course, his head with the very, very pale skin and the dark hair is a focal point because of the extreme contrast. As people move away from the boy, they typically look down here to see the cats, and they see this very high contrast black and white cat, this slightly more muted gray cat, and then of course they notice that the cats, especially this one, are looking very, very interestedly at this magpie. And the magpie itself, of course, has a very high contrast look, and it's quite brightly highlighted against this yellow table. As we keep looking around, we see the beautiful bird cage, very, very dimly focused on the left side, where it almost melts into the shadow, a little bit more clearly defined here on the right, where the negative shape behind it is much brighter. And as we move up here, you'll notice that this big negative shape is not empty at all. It's luminous with this wonderful gradient that he's painted to help us focus on the boy's face. See how the negative shape gets very, very bright, almost a halo around him, whereas it's darker in the corner, and then as you move down the left side, very, very dark, so that the bright red outfit here really glows out of it and is given a wonderful foil. Then as we move down towards the cats again, we see, lo and behold, there is another cat lurking back in the shadows here. Another cat that's almost part of the negative shape. It's woven right into the negative shape. Let's take one more trip around this big negative shape. And I'd just like you to really admire the parts of the painting that you wouldn't normally talk about if you were, say, describing this painting to someone. You might not talk about the golden triangle down here, and then this golden triangle of darker umber, this shadow that makes a diagonal here across the bottom of the painting. The very, very even values here, but the slight line that shows that this has gone from floor to wall, and then the very subtle gradients of value that frame this painting. Again, you might do that thought experiment that we've done on some paintings previously. Try to crop this painting and see if you can improve it by taking away some of that negative shape. And for my money, this painting could not be improved by cropping. Every inch of this space is alive, is activated, is functioning in the painting, even though it is clearly negative space. So let's look at how Käthe Kollwitz, a German expressionist printmaker, uses the negative shape in this composition. In this woodblock, these white lines would have been made by carving away the material, and then, because it's a relief print, the spaces that were left would have been inked with a roller, and then the paper inked probably in a press against the inked block. So the white shapes often have a feeling in a print like this of being handmade, worked by hand, possibly the positive shapes, because they are the ones that have to be specifically created by the artist. The black shape is sort of the given. It's the inked block. It's what's left over. But as you see in this piece, Käthe Kollwitz has allowed the black shapes to sort of leak in to the faces of her figures here. And she has left large chunks of these black shapes uninflected, completely flat, without any detail or imagery, and yet very, very important in the composition. I think that if the composition were to lose any of those big, heavy black shapes, its emotional resonance would be diminished. It has a very melancholy, a sad, an oppressed feeling, possibly. And I believe that a lot of that emotion comes from the way the dark negative shape is allowed to work its way into the figures and fill much of the space. In some painting, it can be very difficult to tell what space is positive and what space is negative, and maybe beside the point. So we've talked about the fact that the abstract expressionist painters really tried to eliminate depiction from their paintings and to get your view to kind of stop at the canvas rather than to use the canvas as a window into another world. And in a painting like this, it may be beside the point to talk about what's positive and what's negative. But yet in much abstract work, we can still talk about positive and negative relationships in which both figure and the ground can have equal importance and often shifting importance. So most people, when I ask them where their eye starts and how it travels through the piece, most people feel that this black and white sort of eye or bullseye is the thing that grabs their eye in this Motherwell collage. Most people tell me that they think these white shapes are positive shapes. And if you look very, very closely, you may be able to see that the white shapes are actually the collage elements. They are collaged onto the yellow ground here. And so they cast a little bit of a shadow. And that really makes them feel like they're positive shapes. And yet, most people, when they look a little further, tell me that these gold, I don't know what you call them, not quite ellipses, but they're sort of oblongs here. One of them is only halfway there, but they begin to assert themselves as positive shapes against a white ground, and so that at least in this neighborhood of the painting, we can begin to see the gold area, which is a purely negative shape up here in the corners, begin to assert itself as a positive shape. So when positive and negative shapes begin to participate a little in each other's qualities like that, when a negative shape has some positive qualities or a positive shape can fall back a bit and allow the negative shape to assert itself, we can call that integrated. Those shapes are interacting or integrated. I'd like you to look at this very simple composition and see how the various shapes in the composition partake of being positive or negative as things change very slightly. So watch here, you've got a big black shape and two black triangles. You might be able to see a little bit of an abstract white shape in here, and you might be able to see, as you look at this, two white triangles beginning to assert themselves just a little bit. If we take that same composition, there's the big black shape, there are the black triangles, and we simply put a black frame around it so that the sides of these white shapes now have a very crisp edge, it's much, much easier to see these shapes as shapes. Moral of this, of course, is that the edges of your format are all important as a designer. Watch what changes now. We've simply taken those same shapes, let them remain against a black background, but we've inverted their values. So now this shape on the left has gone from being white to black, this biggest shape has gone from being black to white, the triangles, etc., etc. So now it's very easy, I think, to see these shapes as positive, simply because their values have been reversed against the ground. In the composition that you're going to be creating, you're going to be presenting two versions of it, one black on white and one white on black. So you'll get a chance to try some of these things with your own composition. Let's look at some more complex compositions. This is a painting by Bev Doolittle, and a very wonderful example of integrated positive and negative space in which both figure and ground have equal importance, or maybe a better way to say it would be that figure and ground are shifting relationships. So at first we might say that the rider and the horses are the positive shapes here, with maybe some things like trees and rocks and a path appearing as positive shapes. But then as we begin to look closer, we might see that there is a face here, a mouth, a nose, eyes that peer at us out of the background, out of the negative shape. And as you look through this, you may see more and more faces peering at you out of the rocks, out of the ground. There are supposed to be 15 faces in here, and I'm going to let you come back and look for them if you want to. This piece by M.C. Escher is another great example of interacting or integrated positive and negative space. So, for example, when we look at this, one very possible way to move through this picture is to see the bright leaves that are lying on the surface of the water because of the contrast that Escher uses. Then as you look more closely at the print, it's very, very easy to see the carp here lurking beneath the surface. And as we begin to realize that we're looking down into water, we become aware of the reflections that are on the water, and they move our eye back into the top of the print and actually out of the print, because they help us to see that there are trees on the edge of the pond on the far side that are reflecting on the water. So as we look at Escher's three worlds, and he's named the print Three Worlds, we get a shifting feeling of what is positive and what is negative. In other words, we give our attention to the three different worlds, probably one at a time. Another thing I'd like to point out that Escher uses here is repetition to unify this piece, and that's something that I'm going to be asking you for in assignment 3. Besides creating an ambiguous space in which all shapes get a chance to be either positive or negative, you're also going to be asked to use repetition to unify the composition. I'm going to show you some more Escher here because pattern and repetition are his long suit. In this wonderful print here, he uses a special kind of pattern or repetition called tessellation. Right here in the very center, you see that the birds that are flying in different directions equal each other's negative space. In other words, they completely use up the negative space between each other without any gaps. This tessellation falls apart a little bit as you move to the right and to the left, and the spaces between the dark birds are revealed to be landscape, and the darkness between the light birds is revealed to be a night sky and a landscape. Then as you move down, the spaces between the birds turn into a patterned landscape of agriculture, and repetition, of course, is also used to give the piece symmetry here. These curving shapes of the water, the shapes of the town, unify the piece and make the composition very symmetrical. You don't have to use that much repetition in your piece, but I like to look at a lot of Escher for this assignment because his way of unifying negative space and creating ambiguous positive and negative space is so interesting. Ambiguous space, the goal, the point of assignment 3, is a space in which figure-ground relationships shift or change or flip-flop as we look at an image. And this image of the black vase with the two white faces on either side of it, probably one that you've seen in some form, it's the classic example of an ambiguous space. Ambiguous space is a special case of the interacting or integrated positive and negative shape that we've been looking at. And this is what you're going to be asked to create in assignment 3. Tessellation, as I was saying, is a wonderful example of this kind of ambiguous space where positive and negative relationships shift back and forth or flip-flop as we give our attention to either, in this case, the little black critters or the little white dancing men here who completely use up each other's negative space in this area. This sort of tessellation, I think any of us would be proud to have designed ourselves, but Escher doesn't stop there. He takes these critters and actually turns them into three-dimensional beings that march out here around the reflecting pool and shake hands with each other in front. What a guy. A little bit of a show-off perhaps, but so much fun. And here is an even more impressive, I think, use of tessellation to tile an illusionistic sphere. This is not a real three-dimensional sphere, of course, but a print. Here he takes a trio of little black imps and designs them so that they completely use up the negative space between a trio of little white angels. And then, of course, the little imps are turned upside down and the angels fit within their heads. And this goes on recursively all the way to the equator of the sphere where the angels and the imps get too small to see. Pretty amazing stunt. Very beautiful. You don't need to use that much repetition, though. This wonderful Jacob Lawrence painting of the seamstress uses a lot of repetition in much looser ways. So, for example, there's a pattern in the wallpaper. There are repeated patterns in the fabric that are lying here. There are repetitions of images, the dress forms, repetitions of color, the red, the green, repetitions of curves, and the hand, the sewing machine, the head, repetitions of finger-like shapes in the fingers and in the scissors, the lozenge shape here of the scissors and the sewing machine, balance wheel are repeated. So these are much more subtle repetitions. They don't qualify as strict pattern or tessellation by any means, but that would be enough repetition to unify your design for assignment 3. As we work on assignment 3 and you attempt to create a design in which every shape has a chance to qualify as positive, you may wish to try the technique of interpenetration. And here we see that the triangles are made to appear continuous because their value shifts when they cross each other so that we can identify the line that carries through. You're only going to have black and white to work with in this assignment. There won't be any gray values, and so you may find this kind of reversal of value to be helpful if you're trying to make a shape continue over or across other shapes. And we see that used here to some extent in this piece of graphic design from a magazine cover. So for example here, this triangle continues past another edge, and you see its value changed to keep the triangle going. Here you see something similar. You also see a lot of shifting positive and negative ambiguity in this design. A lot of fun. This designer had 3 values to work with. You'll only have 2. So let's talk about assignment 3. Our first step is going to be, as before, to start with rough sketches in your sketchbook or on a sheet of 8.5 by 11 paper. That's fine with me. You can work with a pencil. You're also welcome to work with a pen on this if you like. Some folks even like to do their original sketches in Illustrator, and at this point you may be feeling that you're fluent enough in Illustrator that you could just go ahead and do your rough sketches in Illustrator. But for most of you, it's probably going to be easiest to approach this with pencil again. This time you're going to be working with black and white shapes. I'm going to give you a few pages of sketches that students have done for this project. Again, no terrific drawing skill is required. More of an exploratory, playful, having fun attitude is required. You want to think about designs, of course, that use those principles that we talked about a few minutes ago, designs that allow every shape to look positive by paying special attention to breaking up the edges between black and white, allowing shapes to continue out the edges of the format if they seem to be getting too positive in the center. Remember that in order to make all your shapes appear positive, you're going to have to make all your shapes have the opportunity to appear negative so that the shapes around them can kind of shine forth. I'd also like to look at a few examples of student work here to help you see what it is we're after. I encourage you, first of all, to work abstractly again. And after showing you all that Escher, this may sound disappointing, and if you decide that you really want imagery, of course you should go for that. Just remember, the more interesting the shapes you create, the more difficult it is going to be for the shapes around them to look positive. Even when you're dealing with pure abstraction, there are shapes like our famous circle that are so easy to see as positive shapes that the shapes around them, for example, these little leftover looking shapes here, tend to look completely negative and have trouble popping out and appearing to us as negative. When I show this design to many of my students, some of them can see all these shapes as positive shapes, including the black ones. Most people, though, have trouble because of these 2 white circles seeing these black shapes as positive. They look like a background for the circles to a large extent. So watch out for circles. Circles are difficult to deal with. Even in this design that has used interpenetration, a lot of people have trouble seeing these shapes here, for example, and this shape as positive. They seem to be background shapes for those circles, which are so assertive. You may disagree, and these issues are very, very subjective. We'll talk about them in the critique. We'll talk about them as you develop your designs, but watch out for circles. In this composition, the artist has worked exclusively with circles, even some very, very large circles in the background here. And although they are background, most people seem to be able to see them as circles and even to see them pop out as positive shapes. I don't know if you'll agree, these shapes here are definitely easier to see as positive shapes, I think, than these large ones. But anyway, a very interesting attempt to work with the challenging circle for this assignment. I should mention that this student's work was presented on a black board. You will be working within a template. Here is a preparatory sketch for version of this assignment, and although I think it's a beautiful design, and I love these shapes in here, which seem very abstracted, but also seem to almost be recognizable as perhaps spaceships or tree houses or something like that. I can't get away from the feeling that the white shapes are the designed shapes and the black shapes here are the leftover shapes. I've shown this to a number of people, and I'm not the only one that gets this feeling. You may disagree, but it seems to me that, for example, when the artist was drawing this line here, he or she was thinking of this shape on this side of the line rather than this shape on this side of the line. And this question of intention, what shape you're thinking of when you draw an edge, is going to become very, very important for this assignment. We're used to thinking of the mark that we're making or one shape that we are creating as we make a mark. In this assignment, for example, I believe that this artist was probably thinking of these broad white strokes here, these white gestures, you might almost call them, that cross the format in a very energetic and dynamic way. I think it's an interesting composition. I don't think it answers the assignment terrifically well, because these black shapes to me seem like the leftover shapes. They don't have that feeling of design or intentionality. They seem to be the spaces between the white shapes. So you might ask yourself, if this were your design, and if you agree with me, what might you do to make those black shapes assert themselves? What might you do to make the white shapes assert themselves a little less so that the black shapes begin to gain some intentionality? Letters are another thing that's challenging to work with for this design. I think letters are a lot like circles or faces. They attract our attention and they make the shapes around them look negative. I think this is a valiant attempt to use letters, and I applaud designers who try ambitious things like this. I don't think it's entirely successful. Here, I think, for example, that although I can see the letter T here, I can also see the letter R here, and so these shapes almost interact with each other in a completely ambiguous way. Here, however, these shapes seem to be backgrounds for these kind of G-ish or E-ish letters and don't completely function as positive shapes. I have trouble seeing this as a positive shape too. So this is literally what you're being asked to do. You're being asked to design a composition in which every single shape can function as positive. It's challenging. This artist also wanted to work with letters and was having trouble because the shapes around the letters kept looking negative. She finally decided to work with the counters. That's the name for the space inside a letter. It's negative shape, in other words. So she took these counters from from a typeface that she liked and began to play with those, and of course they began to create shapes between them that had a letter sort of feel to them, although she very carefully kept them from ever becoming real letters, and I think got a very snappy design out of that concept. Here's a designer who chose to work with animals, very, very challenging thing to do. He or she has created a sort of an owl image down the center here with the beak and some feathers perhaps and these two big eyes. It's also quite easy to see two little bugs or spiders coming in from either side of the design. Animals are difficult though, because as you saw with the Escher prints, in order to make all shapes look positive, you pretty much have to fill the negative shape of each animal with another animal. I think this is a wonderful and a very graceful design, although I do think that some shapes, for example these in the corners here around the edges of this white critter, seem very negative and can't quite participate in the positive-negative flip-flop. Still, a challenging and very beautiful design. Here's one in which the animal forms have become so distorted and are so playfully rendered that they're really not real animals at all, although with all the eyeballs and mouths and noses here, you kind of feel that there are some hilarious animals lurking in this design. I think it flip-flops rather nicely. In this one, the blacks and whites, I think, participate very equally in the chance to be positive. I can make both of these designs, both the original and the inverted version. I can make them flip-flop very easily in my head and see them both as perfectly ambiguous designs. Now, whether these are as interesting and beautiful designs as the ones that look like animals, that's another question. And you may decide that you really need to work with shapes that represent something. If you do, good luck to you, and I applaud that determination to challenge yourself. I should mention on this design that this is the template that you will be using for your piece. Once you have created your sketches and decided what direction you're going to make one original piece, and then you're going to invert the values for that piece. And in one of the lectures to come, you'll be seeing exactly how that is done. Here's one last piece that has very stylized nature forms, and I think these flip-flop rather well. I can see this design, for example, as white leaves on a black ground, or as sort of black spider webs against maybe a forest of foliage. And I think this is a very fine example of ambiguous positive and negative space. I also really like the way the eye moves through this design. You'll notice that both in the white template and in this older version, I've asked you to show me the movement and the emphasis points in your design, because I don't want you to forget the things you learned about movement and focal point in assignment 2. Those continue to be important and will be important all through this class and for all the design work that you do. So this ends our first lecture on space, and your assignment, of course, is now to create about a dozen small sketches. You only have to create one version of each of your little sketches. You don't need to invert them because that would be fairly tedious to do with pencil. Just crank out a bunch of ideas. Take that nice playful doodling attitude that you took for assignment 2 and create some ideas that use repetition to unify a composition and in which every shape gets an opportunity to shine out as a positive shape. Good luck, have fun, and I will look forward to seeing those sketches very soon.